Kris Hermes. Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for coming out, for welcoming me here to the Marxist School of Sacramento. Thanks, Seth, for that nice introduction. Maybe I'll just flesh that out a little bit with who am I to write a book like this. So I'm actually, I'll start out with who I'm not. I'm not a formally trained legal professional. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a paralegal. I'm an activist, a longtime activist who back in the late 90s was getting arrested a lot with ACT UP Philadelphia in the city of brotherly love, and had to do my own legal support, and for other comrades that I was getting arrested with. And so when the Republican convention came to town in Philadelphia, it seemed like I was well suited to provide legal support for the thousands of people that were expected to come to the city, many of which were expected who were expected to be arrested. So I didn't know it was going to work out this way, but I spent years of my life providing legal support, and really not as a service, not providing legal support as a service, but figuring out ways to engage with activists, arrestees, defendants to radically intervene in the legal system in a way that maybe hadn't been done before, so we could overcome what were pretty fierce opponents of protesters and activists in Philadelphia at the time, namely the city machine, which I will also explain as I read that is broader than just the city. It encompassed federal and state agencies as well. So what I'm going to do, and I'll describe sort of the different themes of the book, but I'm going to talk for a little bit, I'll read for a little bit, and go back and forth between the text and talking about it, and then we can, maybe after we break, we can have a broader discussion. So this book was really a labor of love, but I didn't start it with a sense of excitement. It was started really with a sense of apprehension. I didn't want to actually write the book and was hoping somebody else would write it so that I wouldn't have to. But once I got going, it was indeed a labor of love. And you might ask why this book about an event that happened 15 years ago. Why should I care about that? What's relevant to today's activism and social change going on in the streets? Well, in fact, as far as movements go, very little is the same. This story or set of stories is focused around the global justice movement that is probably most well known around the Battle of Seattle in 1999 with the WTO meetings. And of course, that movement looks nothing like the movement that we see today against police violence, and not only what people look like and the class and race aspects, but also in how people protested. This was a singular event. WTO was a singular event. What's going on today is really ongoing unrest around police violence, and it's spontaneous, happening in cities wherever police are murdering young black and brown people. And so in that way, it's a different set of circumstances. The crossover happens with the type of policing practices that were used then that are used today as well. And also the type of radical legal support that was used back in Philadelphia is also still used today and has a lot of utility to having the backs of people in the streets and being able to demystify the legal system so that people can fight back, not just on the streets, but also in the jails and in the courtrooms, where there is still a lot of oppression and political repression going on. So the two main themes of the book are divided between what I argue are the origins and the development of today's policing model for political demonstrations. So there was a police commissioner in Philadelphia at the time. His name was is John Timoney. Anybody heard of John Timoney? Well, for those who don't know, he was a rising star in the NYPD for almost 30 years before he went to Philadelphia to become the police commissioner. And he was well known for his use of violence and repressive behavior on the New York Police Department. And he took that and really used Philadelphia as a laboratory. Once the WTO meetings happened, the police pretty much had the philosophy that they were not going to let this type of resistance happen again without a fight. And so the police in Philadelphia, as well as Washington, D.C., and other jurisdictions, went to Seattle to study to study what the activists were doing and to study the police response and how they could improve it. So that by the time the Republican Convention came to Philadelphia, there was a developmental process going on that included an array of tactics that we can certainly discuss that will come out in what I'm reading, but include stuff like heavy surveillance and infiltration, preemptive raids on activist spaces, political interrogations, unlawful stops and seizures of people's belongings, mass arrests, and also to keep people in jail, high bails, and overcharging. So there are other tactics as well, but that is what I call the police handbook or playbook that has been used ever since and is being used with great vigor today. The other theme of the book is what activists did to resist those practices. So in jail and in the courtroom, what did dissidents do collectively to respond to what it was very repressive behavior? And there, I'm not going to read too much from that aspect, and we can talk about some of the things that activists did to resist this kind of repression. But I'm going to focus in my reading on the police apparatus that was established and the policing model that is used to this day. Again, that I argue was established and developed in Philadelphia and shortly after. Also, for those who don't know John Timoney's trajectory, he went from being police commissioner in Philadelphia to the police chief of Miami and oversaw one of the most brutal attacks on demonstrators in recent memory at the free trade area of the Americas demonstrations in November of 2003. And now he works for the Kingdom of Bahrain to suppress a popular uprising in that country. Yeah, so he's quite the character. He works currently for an international security firm called Andrews International, and that's who he's on contract with in Bahrain. So I'm going to jump in and start talking about the apparatus that was set up, and given that I'm speaking at the Marxist School of Sacramento, I want to emphasize that the ways in which we see the state approaching dissent political protest is by really enclosing the political movements and the activists of our times, both physically and politically and really economically as well. And so in that way, I hope that I can explain some of this enclosure that goes on, because it is really based in the accumulation of capital that the state and its corporate overlords are trying to restrict our movement, restrict our ability to organize, restrict the advancement of our social change movements. So a section called In the Beginning, I'll start with here. In August 1999, a full year prior to thousands of people protesting in the streets, Philadelphia 2000, which was the host committee's name at the time, the Republican Convention Host Committee, and the city's law department drafted agreements that gave the Republicans both right of first refusal on more than 100 city venues and an omnibus special events permit. Signed in the shadows, away from public scrutiny, these agreements came to embody the hubris of the GOP and the city and their complete contempt for dissent. This contempt would reveal itself in other ways later, but the path had been paved for ultimate deference to the RNC and the Republican Party. On the surface, the space grab was meant to allow free rein in event planning. However, it was also a thinly veiled attempt to prohibit protest activity and limit the ability to hold demonstrations. This is the enclosing space argument. And while the arrangement included provisions for a protest pit, I'm sure many of you know that that's been attempted in the years subsequently, an officially designated free speech zone to pacify any outcry over the exclusion of protest, few were fooled. The pit was to be 40 by 190 feet in size and located at FDR Park, far away from the convention site. Free speech was further curtailed by a requirement that groups apply for one of 72 protest pit time slots, with each slot representing 50 minutes of so-called protest, in a police-run lottery. Meanwhile, Republicans were to have full use of all 10 blocks surrounding the First Union Center, or FU Center it was affectionately known, where the convention was to be held. Two of the first organizations to apply for and be denied permits were Unity 2000, a coalition of more than 100 groups planning what was expected to be the convention's largest march and rally on July 30, and the Ad Hoc Committee to Defend Healthcare, which was planning a smaller march and rally for July 29th. Unity 2000 applied for a permit in February of 2000, this is many months prior to the convention in the summer, and was twice rejected with the explanation that the Republicans had previously reserved the space. The Ad Hoc Committee's permit application was pending at the time, but it too was expected to be rejected. On April 6, 2000, Unity 2000 and the committee filed a federal lawsuit with the help of the American Civil Liberties Union of Pennsylvania. The plaintiffs accused the city of viewpoint discrimination and argued that while the First Amendment clearly guarantees the right of the Republican Party to convene, the same amendment protects the right of those with competing views. The suit further argued Philadelphia cannot prefer Republican over dissenting speech and cannot abrogate its responsibility to accommodate protesting speech by handing over the entire public space to one side of the political spectrum. Under threat of a federal ruling that it was violating the U.S. Constitution by denying permits to protest groups, the city agreed to a settlement on April 28, 2000. As a result of the agreement, the city made significant legal, political, and financial concessions. With the publicity that was generated from the lawsuit, Philadelphia suffered a political defeat that threatened its historical status and the cradle of liberty. The biggest hit taken by the city, however, was a financial one. While Unity 2000 agreed to pay a $10,000 permit fee as part of the settlement, the city agreed to provide all services to the protesters at no charge. This included a stage and sound system, portable toilets, medical services, security, and cleanup services, totaling an estimated $75,000. Yet, despite its political loss, the city continued to deny permits to other protest groups, including the Kensington Welfare Rights Union, which was organizing the March for Economic Human Rights on July 31st. KWRU, as it was known, would have ongoing difficulty around its permit application and other matters right up until the time of the march. So I don't know if folks have experience trying to get permits these days for political protests. A lot of people in the Bay Area at least don't even try anymore to get permits. They just argue that spontaneous protests should be allowed and tolerated. In other parts of the country, it's different, and people are still denied permits and still need to go to court to push back against this exclusionary tactic. And another tactic that is limiting or enclosing on political viewpoint is the level of intelligence gathering, whether it's surveillance or infiltration. So I'm going to read a little bit about that. And I understand there's some folks in the group here who've been involved with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Yeah, we've got some references to that. So surveillance, intelligence gathering, and political profiling. Unity 2000 organizer Michael Morrill noted the existence of electronic surveillance as early as August 1999, a year earlier, when Pennsylvania State Police appeared on an activist listserv. In June 2000, undercover police were seen on at least 5 separate occasions photographing activists coming and going from the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, or WILF.
Those women are dangerous.
They're very dangerous. In fact, that's true. They're politically dangerous anyway. Because WILF is across the street from the Philadelphia Convention Center, the loading docks made a convenient location from which to photograph people. Eventually, the Philadelphia Inquirer, one of the 2 daily newspapers, or the big daily newspapers in Philly, was alerted, and reporters confronted 2 men on June 29th. The undercover officers refused to answer questions and refused to say which law enforcement agency they were with. When the Inquirer asked the FBI about it, a spokesperson would neither confirm nor deny any involvement, though the Bureau had already admitted to electronic surveillance. When the police were asked about their involvement in the photographic surveillance, PPD, the Philadelphia Police Department, spokesperson Lieutenant Susan Slauson flatly denied the allegations. According to the Inquirer, none of the officials would speculate on how such photographs might be used, how the targets might be picked, and what behavior could provoke surveillance. Yet they noted a tip sheet had been distributed by the PPD in recent weeks to Philadelphia area security officials. The tip sheet requested that PPD be notified if there was, quote, a significant increase in the population of predominantly young white males and females in a particular area, especially those who dress in ragtag clothing and dye their hair in multicolors. Oh. End quote. Oh. The people being targeted didn't need this kind of proof that police were profiling them. Nevertheless, the evidence helped to vindicate activist allegations. By the time mainstream media began exposing the surveillance, there had been multiple reports of harassment, politically motivated questioning, and frivolous arrests. On May 18th, 2 people were approached by police while checking email at the University of Pennsylvania. The 2 were detained, asked questions about the upcoming convention and their political beliefs, and eventually arrested for trespassing. They were taken to 2 separate precincts, grilled, and abused for not cooperating. One of the arrestees was released after 4 hours. The other one was further questioned by the Organized Crime Division about whether he had been in Seattle or D.C. and if he knew anyone organizing anti-RNC protests. After refusing to answer questions about Mumia Abu-Jamal, the male arrestee was threatened with anal rape using a nightstick and had ice water poured down his back before being released. In another University of Pennsylvania episode, police arrested a group of 5 young activists watching 4th of July fireworks from a parking garage and charged them with trespassing and conspiracy. Just as with the other arrestees in May, the police questioned this group about where they came from, the locations of any meetings, and their plans for the convention. During their 24-hour detention, the arrestees were also questioned about their political beliefs, whether they were anarchists, and urged to provide the names of anarchists they knew. With just over a week before the convention, the PPD was forced to admit to the politically motivated surveillance of activists. The admission came on July 20th, 2000, roughly a week before the protests, after the Inquirer traced registration records from the license plate of the car used by the plainclothes officers taking photographs. Lieutenant Slauson took full responsibility for her earlier denial, claiming that she didn't check into it before making the comment. But the Inquirer noted that in the 2 weeks following Slauson's original statement, neither Police Chief Timoney nor any other senior police official publicly corrected Slauson's denial. So there's a section I was going to read on law enforcement preparations, but it's a little dated, and I'll skip it, but just to say that there are correlations between what happened here and what happens today in terms of the law enforcement apparatus that's created. Back in this period, it was FBI, Secret Service, and if folks remember FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, was responsible for sort of being the hub of communication for law enforcement, and now this is replaced with fusion centers, and predating fusion centers, there were the Joint Terrorism Task Force outposts all across the country. Basically, around this time frame, there was a new designation that was coming to be known called the National Special Security Event. People heard of that designation?
It's an event?
It's a designation for events that, mainly political events, but prominent events that somehow deserve a multi-million-dollar security apparatus set up around them. So this was originally established by executive order under Bill Clinton, and then was adopted by Congress right around the time of the convention. But what it does is puts the FBI and the Secret Service at the highest levels of authority around security for these special security events, and then creates the apparatus, which includes local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies, and sometimes corporate security agencies as well, or corporate security firms. And it all acts as a hub of communication. So if there's intelligence gathered, if there's infiltration, that information will be put into this hub and disseminated to everybody so that it can be used, often by violating people's rights in the process. So in so doing, this apparatus is also contributing to the enclosure of people's free expression and ability to protest in the streets through chilling of free speech or or mass arrests, like physically taking people off of the streets. But I want to get at something that's not really talked about very much, which is the financing of suppression. What are the financial mechanisms that go into these events and the security that's established around them, and who's paying for it? It seems like a reasonable question to ask. So this took a little bit of research, but was very illuminating. While much of the funds the RNC Host Committee raised were spent on constructing the convention site and paying for staging the event, significant sums were also spent on a massive security apparatus and a PR campaign aimed at convincing Philadelphians that the RNC was going to bring jobs, business, and tourism to the city. The financing behind Philadelphia 2000, again the host committee, was largely revealed in a post-convention report filed with the Federal Election Commission in October 2000. That's the FEC. Between March 97 and September 2000, Philadelphia 2000 raised and spent $66 million. And by some standards, that's a small amount of money for these types of events. Nearly triple the amount spent on the prior 1996 Republican convention in San Diego, and nearly double the original projection of $35 million. According to the 180-page FEC report, the money came from 473 business and government entities. Despite predictions that the private sector would pick up more than half of the bill, taxpayers became the largest donors to the host committee, albeit without their informed consent. I want to stress that. Nobody really knows that the taxpayers are footing the majority of the cost for these conventions. And I'm sure that's not unique to Philadelphia and will happen in Cleveland and Philadelphia again this coming year as they host the Democratic National Convention. Contributing $19 million, the city of Philadelphia was the largest single donor to the convention. So that's not really technically this amorphous marble institution. It's the residents of Philadelphia. $7 million of which was in cash, with the rest as in-kind services, including police, telecommunications, and computer support. Pennsylvania taxpayers contributed $9.4 million, $7 million of which was in cash. Exchanging such large sums in a city that was struggling financially was not lost on Philadelphians. Actually, it was in part lost on them. The Philadelphia Inquirer even commented that the costs borne by taxpayers might have been better used if the city had put money into social services like housing, public education, or public transportation. These days, it's education that's getting the shaft in cities like Philly and Cleveland that are going to host the upcoming conventions. Philadelphia 2000 co-chair David L. Cohen dismissed the Inquirer's assertion, claiming a need to enhance the region's image. Of the more than $27 million raised from the private sector, much of it came with favors. The scheme referred to by the Inquirer as pay-to-play resulted in about 30% of the corporate donors becoming suppliers to the convention. As an example, Pico Energy Company, the largest utility in Pennsylvania, donated more than $600,000 and was paid $1.6 million for supplying power to the convention complex. The largest private investor was Bell Atlantic Corporation, now Verizon Communications, which leveraged its more than $3 million donation to become the convention's official telecommunications provider. Philadelphia 2000 paid about $166,000 for this service, in addition to the $6 to $8 million in revenues expected from people needing services at the convention. Other high-level corporate donors included the TV cable giant Comcast at $1.4 million, AT&T at $1.2 million, and General Motors and Motorola at $1 million each. As early as April 2000, Philadelphia Newspapers Incorporated, which publishes the Inquirer and the Daily News, the two largest daily newspapers in the city, had pledged $50,000 in cash and free advertising space. So if you didn't think there was a connection between the mainstream media and the corporate elite, there you go. But Federal Election Commission filings later revealed that the Philadelphia newspapers actually donated at least $288,000 to the RNC host committee. Besides reaping direct or indirect financial benefit, another aspect of the pay-to-play scheme was the opportunity for corporate executives to curry political favor with the decision makers. Although corruption by the Nixon administration caused Congress to ban corporate underwriting of political conventions, by 1984, the law was relaxed enough to allow nonpartisan host committees to accept unlimited tax-deductible gifts from corporations. Exploiting this relaxation were companies like Microsoft, Daimler Chrysler, and Lockheed Martin. At the time, Microsoft was embroiled in an antitrust lawsuit, some of you may recall that, pursued by the federal government. According to the Philadelphia Inquirer, both Microsoft and Lockheed Martin, which contributed $500,000 and $100,000 respectively, had a slew of issues before Congress and the administration. Daimler Chrysler, which contributed $250,000, benefited from its investment by being able to host parties and set up vehicle displays for delegates and politicians at the convention center. Insurance company Ace I&A Group, which contributed $100,000 to the convention, hosted a golf tournament at its lodge in suburban Philadelphia for the 31 Republican governors in attendance. The FEC report also helped to identify what the RNC host committee spent its money on. The $66 million price tag included $13 million for police and security systems. Again, that's relatively low for contemporary, by contemporary policing standards. $10.8 million for constructing the convention complex and building a tent city for reporters in the parking lot. $2.7 million for free transportation of delegates. And the convention site was at least 3 to 5 miles away from where most people were staying. $1 million for loaner cars, $150,000 for portable toilets, and $3,500 per month for 15 months to rent a 3-story roof-decked apartment in one of Philadelphia's most expensive downtown districts for a top Republican convention official, whoever that might have been. The money spent by the host committee was also not always dispersed locally or regionally. For example, the 3 businesses employed by Philadelphia 2000 that received the most money, totaling nearly $12 million, or about 20% of the host committee's budget, were a general contractor from Louisiana, a production company from California, and a transportation management company from Virginia. The Louisiana-based Freeman Decorating Company, which earned $5.4 million for building the convention complex, also held the contract for the 1996 Republican Convention in San Diego and was chosen for the RNC 2000 over local Philadelphia bidders. The most rewarding investment made by the host committee, however, was a little-known insurance policy purchased behind closed doors many months prior to the convention. While it was suspected that the city had taken out a policy to protect itself from liability, confirmation of that policy, as well as the cost and extent of its protection, was not known until many months after the convention. In a February 2001 Philadelphia News article, FEC filings for the RNC host committee were revealed that outlined filings were revealed that outlined the city's protection from liability for false arrest, wrongful detention or imprisonment, malicious prosecution, assault and battery, discrimination, humiliation, violation of property rights, violation of civil rights, wrongful eviction or entry, and defamation, slander, or libel of persons or organizations.
Wow.
So let that sink in, that the police knew all along, well, the city and the police and all sorts of law enforcement agencies knew that they were going to be able to do things to violate people's rights, and they would get away with it because they had this insurance policy.
That's a weird insurance policy.
It is strange, and it should not be allowed to be sold, but this continues to happen. It happened in St. Paul, the Twin Cities, for the 2008 Republican Convention, and it happened in, I believe, Chicago for the 2012 NATO demonstrations.
Any idea how much it costs for a policy?
I want one.
Yeah, well, you'll have to read my book.
Okay.
That's the upfront cost.
That's a deal.
So that's where I'm going to stop reading, and maybe I can prime us for the discussion after the break by talking about what activists did to counter this level of repression. And I want to emphasize that these kinds of things and many more tactics that the state uses are still being used today. And so the ideas and the strategies and the tactics that can be employed by activists, that were employed by activists that I write about in here, can still be used, and really, in my opinion, should be used to fight back against such a repressive system. I mentioned a few of the police tactics that were used that include the denial of protest permits, political interrogations, unlawful search and seizure, surveillance infiltration, preemptive raids. One thing that is probably one of the most noteworthy events that happened in this period was a raid on a puppet warehouse, as it was called, where people were making art, political propaganda, First Amendment material to pass out at the demonstrations. And the afternoon of demonstrations that were to take place later that night, the puppet warehouse was raided, and it was based on intelligence gathered by 4 union stagehands that were infiltrating on behalf of the Pennsylvania State Police. And a little twist to the story, I won't go into too much detail here, but Philadelphia is one of the few cities in the country that has a consent decree, essentially a consent decree, preventing it from infiltrating political groups without the express permission of the mayor, the police commissioner, and the city manager. And the city of Philadelphia got no permission to infiltrate, but what they did instead, by using this hub of law enforcement communication, the state police, under the authority of the governor, at the time it was Tom Ridge, who later became the head of Department of Homeland Security. It was their infiltration that was used to create the affidavit and the ultimate search warrant to raid the puppet warehouse and arrest all 70 people inside and prevent this art and propaganda from getting out onto the streets. That tactic has been used repeatedly since then. It's extremely effective and also can involve administrative agencies like the fire department, in this case licensing and inspection was used to shut down the space. When I say it's an effective technique or tactic, it's effective for the state, obviously, not so pleasant for the people being arrested or shut down. And then subsequently, there was vast overcharging. More than 400 people were arrested here. The number of people arrested may vary in different jurisdictions depending on the police force or the goals of the state. But it's essentially to get people off the streets. There were known organizers who were targeted in this instance and held on $1 million bails. Some people were held on $500,000 bails. This type of punitive and high-level bails and bond is also something that has been repeated over the last 15 years. Most notably recently with the movement for Black Lives, in that people who may have had prior arrest warrants or prior warrants, usually for not paying a fine, as the case may be, were being held on very high bonds or bail. And so there often needs to be a bail fund set up so that people can get activists back out onto the street and out of jail. So just very quickly, some of the things that activists did included using their collective strength, forming bonds of solidarity while in jail to clog up the jail system, to refuse to cooperate with jail authorities, and make it very difficult to process them. Those tactics have been used over the last 100 years in various movements to mitigate punishment, to try and get people released as quickly as possible by overburdening the jail system. It's worked with varying degrees over the years, but the idea is that if you're unified and sort of a single body, you can assert your collective strength much better than you can as an individual atomized in the system. And you can also use collective action inside the jail to protect people who are being marginalized or targeted, like known organizers, immigrants, people of color, queer folk. There are tactics that can be used to protect them, and those were exercised as well, and you can read about them more in depth. One of the unfortunate realities in Philadelphia was that people were going up against a very resistant and formidable state structure, if you will, that included the mayor. It was Mayor John Street at the time, the police commissioner John Timoney, the district attorney Lynn Abraham, who was called the deadliest DA in the country at that time. She had sent more people to death row than any other district attorney. And others in this sort of old boys club. This group of people were so stubborn and resistant to conceding anything to activists that people basically stayed in jail for 2 weeks, hundreds of people, and got brutalized when they refused to cooperate. Some people refused to be fingerprinted and felt the full repercussion of the state. Very violent. And it's possibly because of that reaction that jail solidarity, as it was called, is not used so much today, although it does happen, or seems to happen in cyclical waves. So I'm not sure if we'll see another resurgence of jail solidarity in the future, but certainly that's an option available to activists who want to resist the force of the state. although jail solidarity may not have been completely successful as defined by getting out quickly with the lowest level charges, there were bonds of solidarity created that were carried over into the legal system. So people were excessively charged. One of the defendants who I'm going to be speaking with on Sunday at the Howard Zinn Book Fair, Kate Sorensen, was held on $1 million bail, and she was charged with 10 misdemeanors and 10 felonies. Ultimately, she was vindicated, but at the time, it was a very scary situation, and what was important to people was to use their solidarity to fight back against this kind of targeting in the legal system and figure out ways to intervene, again, in a radical way, not your common go get a lawyer and try your best to beat the charges. In this scenario, it wasn't necessarily a priority to beat the charges. It was to bring your political issues and the reasons why you were on the street, as well as the repression that went on, into the courtroom with you. And so facilitating all of this was what's called a legal collective. Folks familiar with legal collectives? Groups of mainly activists. In this case, it was very activist-led and defendant-led, not lawyer-led, which is an important distinction. And they really acted to demystify the legal system for the activists going through their particular legal predicament. So gaining that knowledge helped to better understand how they could obstruct the normal mechanism of the legal system. So, for example, the legal collective facilitated mass meetings of people so that they could arrive at consensus decisions about what to do. Namely, people were denying plea bargains en masse. So a common technique to get rid of criminal cases quickly so that the state doesn't need to spend any more money than it has to, it will offer a plea bargain to defendants. So people refused plea bargains in the hundreds and demanded jury trials. They represented themselves pro se. And there were trainings that went on to educate people how to represent yourself in court. And of course, by representing yourself, you're really politicizing your case. You're able to do things that a normal lawyer can't do in court, and you're able to make statements. You're able to convey evidence. Perhaps you were beaten in the process of being arrested, like many people were. You could use that in the courtroom in your defense more so than a lawyer would be able to. The theme in all of this, in terms of how activists use their collective strength in court, is to politicize their case, to draw attention to what happened, bring the media into the courtroom, pack the courtroom with your comrades, your fellow activists. That was very important to show support and solidarity, and also to make sure not only the judge and jury sees that there are supporters in the courtroom, but the media understands that this is important to not only the people being prosecuted, but the greater movement. There were all sorts of tactics used by supporters and defendants alike, from the slightly banal of raising fists in solidarity to the more provocative unfurling banners in the courtroom or wearing attire, political attire on your body, taping our mouths shut, and making political statements. If a defendant is convicted, they get an opportunity to make a political statement at sentencing. So this was taken advantage of and exploited. But generally, we found ways to push the envelope of the court system, risk contempt actually in a lot of situations, in order to be able to push back against again a repressive effort to prosecute hundreds of people. So that ended with 97% of activists being acquitted or getting their cases dismissed in the process. It's just that it took about 3 years of our lives to make that happen. So it's definitely a time commitment, and you have to weigh the pros and cons of whether that's something that you as an individual or collectively as a movement you want to have to deal with, and it does take some level of privilege to be able to take off time from your life and essentially a loss of income to be able to support fellow comrades and friends and family. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. Large nutshell. There's so much to talk about in what went on and how it applies to today's movements for social change. I can't begin to cover it all, but hopefully we can start to have conversations about some of this after break and talk more about it. So thank you.